In the heart of the Andes, a plane crashes, leaving a group of people trapped in a frozen, desolate wilderness. With no rescue in sight and no way out, every second counts. As hunger and cold begin to take their toll, the survivors are forced to make decisions so unthinkable, they will haunt them forever. What happened next? You won't believe it. Stay with us as we unravel the chilling true story of survival, where the line between life and death is thinner than you could ever imagine. October 13, 1972, seemed like a typical day for the passengers aboard Uruguayan Flight 571. A small charter plane, the Fairchild FH-227D, carried 45 passengers, rugby players from the Old Christians Club, their friends and families, on a routine flight from Montevideo, Uruguay, to Santiago, Chile. They were excited, eager for the upcoming match, anticipating their arrival in Santiago and looking forward to a good time. The skies were clear at first, and the air was filled with laughter and casual conversation. The passengers were enjoying the flight, unaware that the next few months would become a battle for survival. Here is the picture of original flight which they were boarding.
My name is Nando Parrado, and I was 21 years old when the crash happened in the Andes Mountains in 1972.
My name is Roberto Canesa. Before the crash, I was a second-year medical student.
As the plane soared high above the Andes, a mountain range that separated Argentina from Chile, a storm was brewing. Clouds formed quickly, and the weather began to change, shifting from peaceful and clear to ominous and dangerous. The pilots, already familiar with the tricky air currents around the mountains, began to notice that the visibility was rapidly deteriorating. The clouds were thickening, and the winds began to pick up. This was no ordinary storm. They had to adjust their altitude, trying to navigate through what seemed like an invisible sea of thick clouds. The passengers, unaware of the situation in the cockpit, continued to relax. Some joked, while others closed their eyes to take a nap. However, the calm would soon be shattered. Without warning, the plane's left wing scraped against a mountain ridge, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. The passengers screamed in terror, feeling the plane lurch and twist through the air. The nose of the plane dipped sharply as the pilots fought to regain control. It was too late to handle. The plane crashed into the unforgiving terrain of the Andes. The impact was deafening. The sound of metal tearing, glass shattering, and people crying out in pain filled the air. The survivors were tossed about the cabin, their bodies slamming against the sides of the plane. For a moment, everything was darkness and silence. When the chaos settled, and the dust began to clear, those who had survived the initial crash began to stir. The cold, cutting air of the Andes greeted them, and they found themselves in an unimaginable nightmare. The landscape around them was bleak. Snow-covered mountains surrounded them, and a chilling wind blew through the wreckage of the plane. The body of the aircraft lay broken, its wings torn off, and pieces of debris scattered in every direction. Among the 45 passengers, 28 survived the crash, though many were severely injured. Some had broken limbs, while others had deep gashes on their heads. The survivors were dazed and confused, unsure of what had just happened. What struck them most was the silence. The world they had known just hours before had been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by their own labored breathing and cries of pain. They were stranded at more than 12,000 feet above sea level, a place where no one could hear their cries for help. The passengers who were still conscious began to assess their situation. They quickly realized that no one would be coming to rescue them immediately. The cold was unbearable, and the snow began to fall heavily. They were surrounded by jagged peaks, with no visible signs of civilization. The radio on board had been damaged in the crash, and the chances of contacting anyone seemed slim. The survivors were left with nothing but their wits and the strength to survive. The first night in the Andes was one of the hardest the survivors would face. It was a brutal combination of freezing temperatures and complete darkness. They had nothing to protect them from the elements except the wreckage of the plane, which offered some shelter from the snow and wind, but was far from safe. With limited clothing and no sleeping bags, the survivors huddled together for warmth. They tried to find comfort in each other's presence, using whatever they could find to keep warm, but it was no use. The cold seeped into their bones, numbing their bodies and minds. In the absence of light, the survivors could only hear each other's breathing and the occasional cry of someone in pain. They were cold, hungry, and scared. As the hours stretched on, it became clear that their situation was far worse than any of them had imagined. The days would be difficult, but the nights, especially the first few, were excruciating. Despite the overwhelming fear and uncertainty, the survivors clung to a fragile hope. Surely, help would come soon. Rescuers would find them. They weren't alone. They couldn't be alone. But as dawn approached, the truth set in. No one was coming. The search and rescue teams had no idea where they were.
Minutes went by and hours, days and months before we were rescued. I mean, it was crazy how they couldn't find us.
The thick clouds had obscured their flight path, and with no signals to guide them, the rescuers had abandoned the search. The survivors, alone and stranded, realized that they would have to rely on each other to make it through this disaster. In the days that followed, the survivors began to ration their supplies. There were a few chocolate bars, some crackers, and a couple of bottles of wine. But it wasn't enough. It was barely enough to get through a day. The group had to think quickly. Every moment mattered. Every minute that passed without help could mean another life lost. They searched through the wreckage, looking for anything that could be of use. Some survivors were able to locate a few small items. Broken seat cushions that could be used as makeshift bedding, small parts of the fuselage that could serve as shelter from the wind. But nothing they found would solve their bigger problem: food. After a few days, it became clear that the group would not survive much longer on the meager rations they had. Their bodies were already weakening from the cold and lack of nutrition. The survivors began to realize that their only hope of survival lay in their ability to make harsh, unimaginable decisions. Decisions that would change them forever. The days passed, and starvation began to take its toll. Some of the survivors, though still alive, were growing weaker by the hour. The group had a difficult choice ahead of them. The food was running out, and without any viable source of sustenance, they knew they would not survive much longer. After much discussion, one of the survivors, Nando Pardew, proposed a horrifying idea. They could use the bodies of the deceased to stay alive. The survivors, desperate and out of options, knew there was no other choice. Their ethical and moral values were torn apart, but survival instinct prevailed. It was an excruciating decision. No one could ever have imagined such a thing, and yet, it was the only way they could survive. The group faced a moral dilemma. Do they stay true to their beliefs and die, or do they break every boundary of decency to stay alive? It was not an easy decision, and the survivors wrestled with it. But hunger, desperation, and the primal need to survive soon overwhelmed their guilt. They made the choice, and as hard as it was to admit, it became their only lifeline. The survivors continued to endure the physical and mental toll of their situation. Every day felt like an eternity, but they did not give up. They worked together, taking turns keeping watch and organizing their resources. They knew that time was running out, and each day they stayed alive brought them closer to the possibility of being rescued. They were taking pictures with the only camera left. The cold continued to plague them, and their bodies began to suffer from frostbite and other injuries. Yet, despite the hardships, the survivors maintained a glimmer of hope. They knew they had to push forward. The Andes were harsh, but the human will to live was stronger than any obstacle they faced. After enduring 72 harrowing days in the Andes, with starvation, freezing temperatures, and injuries weighing heavily on them, the survivors were running out of time. The decision was made to attempt one final desperate bid for help. Nando Pardew and Roberto Canessa, two of the stronger survivors, knew that if they didn't leave the crash site, their friends wouldn't last much longer. With courage in their hearts and the determination to save their friends, they set off into the unforgiving mountains. The journey was nothing short of grueling. They left the wreckage on December 12, 1972, carrying only makeshift sleeping bags, a few scraps of food, and the hope that something, anything, lay beyond the endless horizon of ice and rock. For 10 days, they trekked through snow, crossed deadly crevices, and scaled ridges that seemed impossible to overcome. Every step was agony, their bodies weakened from weeks of starvation. At night, they huddled together for warmth, their thoughts consumed by the fate of those they'd left behind. Would they ever see them again? Would their journey end in vain? On the 10th day of their grueling hike, they caught a glimpse of a sign of life. A small river flowing below them. It was a sign that they were descending, moving closer to civilization. Days later, they spotted something extraordinary: cattle grazing in the distance. For the first time in months, they saw signs that they might not be alone. On December 20th, 1972, as they followed the river, a miraculous encounter occurred. From across the river, a Chilean shepherd named Sergio Catalan spotted the two men, haggard, weak, and waving desperately for attention. They were almost unrecognizable, their bodies emaciated, their faces hollow from weeks of hardship. Using a piece of paper and a pencil, Catalan threw a note tied to a rock across the river, asking them who they were. With trembling hands, Nando wrote back, "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. There are 14 others still alive." Catalan, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately set off on horseback to alert authorities, promising the two men that he would bring help. For Nando and Roberto, the wait was agonizing, but hope, real, tangible hope, was finally on the horizon. As soon as the authorities were informed, a massive search and rescue operation was launched. Helicopters, search teams, and local authorities were mobilized to locate the crash site and bring the remaining survivors home. Nando and Roberto, physically exhausted but emotionally driven by the urgency of their mission, guided the rescuers toward the location of the wreckage. It took 2 days for the helicopters to reach the crash site due to the severe weather and the complexity of the terrain. On December 22, 1972, the first helicopter arrived. The scene that greeted them was beyond words. This is the actual footage took on that day. The survivors, who had lived through unimaginable horrors, emerged from the remnants of the aircraft, their eyes hollow, their bodies gaunt and thin, wrapped in whatever remnants of clothing they could find to stave off the relentless cold. The first helicopter could only fit a few survivors, and due to the high altitude and thin air, the rescue operation had to be conducted in multiple trips. The first group was taken to safety, leaving the rest to anxiously wait for the helicopter's return. The rescue team worked quickly, knowing that the weather could turn at any moment. In those high altitudes, a sudden snowstorm could make any future attempts impossible. During the second airlift, one of the rescuers stayed behind with the remaining survivors, providing them with blankets, food, and comforting words. The first real meal they had eaten in over 2 months. The rescue team knew that if the weather turned or mechanical issues arose, it could mean the end for those left behind. Every moment was tense, and each flight was a delicate balance between weight and altitude, testing the limits of the aircraft. Finally, on December 23rd, after hours of back-and-forth flights, all 16 survivors were safely rescued. It was a moment of overwhelming relief and joy as they were finally flown out of the icy prison that had been their home for over 2 months. Tears streamed down their faces, not just for their survival, but for the friends they had lost along the way. The story of Flight 571 became one of the most famous survival stories in history. It was a tale that challenged the limits of human endurance, questioned the ethics of survival, and showcased the incredible strength of the human spirit. Books were written, documentaries were made, and the world listened in awe as the survivors shared their story. Their ordeal became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of teamwork, determination, and the will to live. They had made choices no one should ever have to make, and their story would forever remind the world of what it truly means to survive. Every year, the survivors of Flight 571 gather to remember those who did not make it, honoring their memories and the bond they share. Though time has passed, the experience of those 72 days in the Andes remains a part of them. A part of their story that will never fade, a legacy of survival that will never be forgotten. If you liked the story, hit like and subscribe if you want more story on history, mystery, and more.